True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
It was back in September of 1985, and two Muncie, Indiana teenagers were shot and killed in their car while they were parked in the popular Westside Park. These murders stunned Muncie families because the victims were well-liked students at Muncie's Northside High School. Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon were found late at night by the police officer who was clearing out the park after closing time. Their car was still running with one window down and the other shattered by gunfire. Join us at the quiet end for the Westside Park Murders. From the very beginning, investigators were inundated with possible suspects, from family members to serial killers. Suggested motives ranged from a random killing to a family dispute to a drug deal gone wrong. Although many leads have been investigated over these years, this remains a cold case and an enduring mystery. So it should be a really interesting discussion today.
I'm planning it. So we got a beer for this crime, this double murder. And actually, I have a beer that's brewed in Muncie, Indiana, where the crime took place.
Well, that's perfect.
So this is Blot Out the Sun from Three Floyds Brewing Company in Muncie. It's an imperial stout, 10.4% alcohol by volume. So we're going to share this one, Jill.
Sounds good.
It's a black color, has sort of a medium-sized brown head, nice aroma, coffee, cocoa, roasted malt, very nice taste, espresso, dark chocolate. There's a little bit of late hops, which I thought was a little bit of a distraction.
So too hoppy?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, a stout's not meant to be hoppy.
Right, yeah.
So if I notice that it's hoppy, to me that means it's over-hopped.
Okay.
But that's a small quibble. It's a good beer.
Okay, well, let's open it up.
Okay.
I can definitely smell the coffee. Smells good.
It's pretty coffee forward.
All right, let's go down to the quiet end and have a talk.
Sure. So we got a note. Actually, I got the same note 3 times from a person that said fake beer noise, which, I don't know, it's a real beer opening that we've recorded.
Well, maybe it's just that it sounds similar each time because I only have a couple that we recorded that we reuse.
Yeah.
It's really not easy to just record the beer every day. It doesn't always sound that good. You have to move the microphone over to the can and stuff or the bottle.
That's right.
So it's not fake, but it may be pre-recorded from another beer.
Yeah.
Yes. We don't record opening a beer every time we do an episode.
Yes, that's well said.
Okay.
All right. Enough of that. Let's go. So like you started, we're in 1985. This is September 27th. Just another Friday for Northside High School students. We're getting to the beginning of a highly anticipated weekend. There weren't a lot of options for what to do on Friday and Saturday nights in Muncie. You could go to a football game, hang out at the Muncie Mall, or see a movie. Back to the Future was playing downtown. So if you were a young couple seeking romance and privacy, you might take your portable radio and listen to music in your car at Westside Park.
Yeah, what we used to call boom boxes, right?
Right. And it's, nothing like hanging out with your good friend, making out, and seeing what happens.
Okay.
So Ethan Dixon showed up at school Friday morning wearing his usual blue jeans and a polo shirt. He spoke with a friend in the parking lot, and this friend, Julie, was dropping off a friend and then skipping school. She was going to southern Indiana for the weekend, and she invited Ethan to come along. But he declined. He told her that he had a test that day and he couldn't miss it.
Yeah, so that would kind of haunt Julie. If only he'd gone with her, right?
That's right.
So at the end of the day on Friday, the junior class officers had a meeting and Ethan was the class president. The class treasurer had questions for Ethan, but she decided she'd talk with him on Monday. But we know for Ethan that Monday never came. Shortly after 9 p.m. that Saturday, Ethan picked up Kimberly at her home. This is where she lived with her mother Nancy and her stepfather Donald Vogelgesang. So that's a trippy name.
It's German. Singing bird or something like that, or the bird sang.
Okay.
Vogel's bird.
Okay. So Kimberly's father was a Muncie physician named Anthony Dowell, and he was living with his second wife in Indianapolis. Ethan lived with his parents, Stephen K. Dixon, right there in Muncie. So at 11:50 p.m. that Saturday, Muncie police officer Terry Winters was walking his canine dog partner in Westside Park when he saw a small red Volkswagen hatchback with its engine still running. Now, it wasn't unusual to find cars parked there at night. He thought it was a couple of kids making out or whatever. Officer Winters worked the late shift for the Muncie Police Department, and he was at the park to walk his dog, but also to tell people who were hanging out in parked cars to move along because the park closed at 11 p.m. So he was checking on vehicles when he saw fresh tire tracks near the west end of the park, and that's when he followed the tracks and saw the Volkswagen hatchback. He walked over to the car and shined his flashlight into an open window, and what he saw was just such a shock that he said he just stood there in the dark for a moment, digesting it. Inside of the car, he saw bodies, 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, who were soon identified as Ethan Dixon and Kimberly Dowell. Ethan had been shot in the torso, and Kimberly had been shot in the head, and both of them were still fully clothed.
So Winters called in his discovery to police dispatch. Moments later, another Muncie police officer, Joe Winkle, arrived at the scene. And as the seriousness of the crime became known, more and more police arrived, including the deputy chief of police. County Coroner Glenn Scroggins was called to the scene. Scroggins was an experienced death investigator who had worked many murders. By Sunday morning, the discovery of 2 dead bodies was front-page news in Muncie. Names weren't released to the public, but word spread fast. A photo was published in the Muncie Star on Monday morning, showing investigators standing to the side of the car with a flashlight aimed in a window. The car doors are open, and you can see the shattered glass on the passenger's side window, but you can't see the bodies. The time of their deaths was reported as sometime between when the park closed at 11 and when they were found just before midnight. The city's homicide investigation team was at the scene all night, and by the time the article with the photo was published, police said that no suspects or motives were immediately apparent, and that no signs of a robbery had been found.
Yeah, so I think that would cause a bit of a panic in the community. Is there just some random killer on the loose?
Yeah.
It's frightening.
It wasn't a robbery.
No.
Wasn't a rape or anything like that, or any sexual crime.
No.
They were just shot. They weren't beaten.
No, and also, there was really no one who had a motive to kill these kids. At least not that anyone could think of.
Yeah, so what's going on?
It's a mystery. Muncie newspapers, the Star and the Muncie Evening Press, reported that Ethan died from a single gunshot wound to his torso, and Kimberly died from a single gunshot wound to her left temple. A third shot was fired, police said, which shattered the passenger side window of the Volkswagen hatchback, which did belong to Ethan's family, the Dixon family. Police said they were continuing to interview several people who had been in the park on the night of the killings. They'd found an open knife on the dashboard and a gun holster underneath Ethan's body, but no gun. Witnesses did say that 3 people were seen around this car shortly after the shots were heard, but unfortunately no one could identify any of them. So on Sunday, September 29th, Ethan and Kimberly's autopsies were done. They were killed less than 12 hours earlier in Westside Park. Their bodies were moved from the crime scene to the hospital pathology department, less than a mile away. Both procedures were performed by a young pathology resident at the hospital who'd graduated from Indiana University School of Medicine just 2 years earlier, and the coroner, Glenn Scroggins, had been elected in 1982. In Indiana, it was pretty common for coroners to have no education or training in medicine or pathology, which seems really strange. But for decades, funeral home directors worked as coroners. Voters have also elected a series of former police officers, firefighters, and fire investigators as the coroner since then. So that to me is really interesting. You would think you would want a pathologist to do that.
I would probably want to have that done. At the same time, they're going to have an autopsy that's performed by a physician. But yeah, it seems that a coroner with medical training might be more able to interpret clues and evidence.
Yeah, Scroggins seemed okay. He did have some experience. But, we've done other cases where the coroner had no clue, or they'd call the coroner in the middle of the night and he'd say, all right, that's an accident or whatever.
I remember that.
Yeah, but this one's better than that.
So Kimberly's autopsy found the cause of death was a gunshot wound to her head, right near her left ear. Fragments of the bullet were found lodged in the base of her skull. The autopsy's toxicology report showed no alcohol, cannabinoids, cocaine, barbiturates, opiate alkaloids, amphetamines, quaaludes, Valium, or PCP in Kimberly's system. There were traces of acetaminophen, so she took some Tylenol, probably. They found that. The report noted that the time between being shot and dying was within mere seconds, so she must have been struck in a vital area of the brain. The resident also noted that both of the car's front seats were in a reclining position, with sleeping bags draped over both victims. Kimberly was found on her back, with her arms raised above her head.
Yeah, so that was a little strange.
That is strange.
In Ethan's autopsy, there was also no trace of any drugs or alcohol. Ethan was described as a 16-year-old white male who was found reclining in the driver's seat of his car. And the window on his side was open and the engine was running. He was also lying on his back when he was found. He'd been shot in his left chest, near his 6th rib. His coronary artery, heart, and left lung were lacerated and perforated by the bullet. So his cause of death was a gunshot wound to the chest that caused exsanguination, or severe blood loss. So he died within probably a couple of minutes.
Oh, with that type of injury? Yeah, he'll bleed out pretty fast.
So in the days following the murders, Muncie police received hundreds of calls from people who thought they saw or knew something about that night. Some of the tips did seem promising. In the September 30th edition of the Muncie Star, police said they had information that other people were in the park that night, and they asked them to contact the police immediately. So the article included the phone number for their office. Coroner Scroggins said an examination of the bullets removed during the autopsies identified that they had been shot with a .38 caliber handgun. On the morning of Tuesday, October 1st, the Star reported, "Slayings might involve 3, police say." And Police Lieutenant David Nicholson said that investigators had been told as many as 3 people had been seen around the car after the shots were fired. Police also said that a vehicle was reportedly seen near Ethan's car, and it had left the park quickly after the gunshots were heard. Now, as many as 12 cars were in the park at that time when the murders happened, and the owners of 8 of those cars had been identified, but not the other 3 or 4. They weren't sure. Now, this article ended with another request for anyone with information about the case to call investigators. And many people would call, but most of these calls just weren't helpful, which tends to be the case when you put out a request for tips. You can be inundated with just some craziness.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's always people that think they've seen things or heard things and trying to be helpful.
Yeah, and then there's people who just want to insert themselves for attention also.
Sure. And even the people that might know something might be putting it out to the investigators in vague terms that they're not really sure.
Sure.
So, but yeah, it is stuff to follow up.
It is, and you can't turn them down. You need to look into every lead you get. It's just a lot of work.
A lot of work. And this is tougher with this case because, like you said, there's no motive.
Right. Yeah, so, no apparent motive.
And on Thursday, October 3rd, the Muncie Star reported that the death investigation was focusing on 2 cars and their drivers. The article read, "One of them has got to be a damn good witness, and the other one is a suspect." So one car was thought to be a dark vehicle that was sometimes referred to as a Chevrolet Monte Carlo.
Very common car at the time.
Very. 3 witnesses said that they had heard gunshots, but they didn't call police. Some of them were afraid and took off. Police Chief Scroggins said that the police believed they could rule out a random killer. They also dismissed early rumors that the murders were somehow connected to the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Tips called into the police came in so fast that investigators had a hard time fielding them all. One person the police considered as a suspect, but later eliminated, was the owner of a well-known Muncie restaurant. The man was known for shooting often at a local gun range. A deputy marshal from a smaller town nearby came forward and said that he was in Westside Park that night and thought he could identify the suspect. Yeah, he described a guy in a car, which he believed to be Donald Vogelgesang, Kimberly Dowell's stepfather. Well.
So he's an early suspect.
Yes, he is. So, and what was the deputy marshal doing in Westside Park that night? Was he with a...
He was there off duty.
Yeah, so he was there making out like the other people.
That's my understanding of it.
And the naming of the guy as the suspect, this police officer personally familiar with Vogelgesang?
Yes.
Okay.
And they weren't friends or anything, but he did know who he was.
So I'm thinking then, if I've got an eyewitness who's identified the guy, that sounds like a good lead.
Well, some people thought so, but there really was no reason. Why would he want to kill his stepdaughter? Just about everyone said they got along pretty well. And then why would he kill her boyfriend? That's just kind of weird. I don't know if that's a very good suspect, but some police do believe he's the guy to this day.
Well, I'm just thinking, you've got a police officer, basically, who was in the park that night and named Vogelgesang as the suspect. That sounds pretty good.
Well, yeah, according to police, he had gone to Westside Park that night in the hours after the teenagers were shot to death, though. And when he was stopped at the entrance to the park by a police officer, the stepfather asked what had happened. And the officer told him that 2 people had been shot, but that the identities of the victims had not yet been released. But that's not all of it.
No, according to investigators, Vogelgesang had been seen by a deputy marshal parked in Westside Park earlier that night, though contradictory stories here. The deputy marshal was interviewed under hypnosis and said he believed Vogelgesang continued to drive to the area where minutes later Ethan and Kimberly were shot.
So I don't know if they're really conflicting because he could have been there twice.
He could have, though he didn't say that.
No, he did not say that.
So I think you have someone that needs a little bit more investigating.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, he will be investigated.
So a couple who was also in the park that night identified photos of a car that police believed was Vogelgesang's, but they couldn't identify the driver of the car. Deputy Police Chief Campbell began to focus on Vogelgesang as the prime suspect in the case, and he asked Kimberly's stepfather to meet him for an interview.
So a Muncie police lieutenant questioned Vogelgesang, and he consented to a polygraph exam, which he passed. But Campbell wasn't swayed by these polygraph results. When he followed up after the polygraph, he asked Vogelgesang if he was in the park, and Vogelgesang answered, "Within my body, I wasn't there."
Say what?
Yeah, so Campbell asked him then, "What the fuck are you talking about? You were either there or not there." But apparently, Vogelgesang gave the same elusive answer. And in follow-up interviews over the years, police sources said that he had also said something like, "If I was there, you'll have to tell me I was there." So what the hell does that mean?
What's going on here?
That's really weird, and I don't think they could just let it lie there.
No. I mean, on the one hand, he took and passed a polygraph, so that would usually be enough to eliminate him as a suspect, right?
Yeah, but of course those things are not that reliable.
I know. And it seems to me that when something like this is done, if you fail the polygraph, everybody knows about it. And if you pass it, nobody knows about it.
Yeah, that's true. You're right.
But he is talking kind of nonsensical, isn't it?
Yeah, so maybe if he was crazy, maybe he didn't really need much of a motive. Who knows?
Who knows?
I'd like to know more about this guy, but it's really hard to find out more about him. So we have to go with what police have released about him.
Yes. So Campbell and other police investigators took the transcripts of their interviews to the Southern Police Institute in Louisville, where an investigator told them that Vogelgesang was a control freak who was unlikely to talk to the police again. And in fact, when the police tried to schedule a follow-up interview with Vogelgesang, they were advised by his attorney that his client would not be sitting down to talk with police again.
So I wouldn't say that's a sign of guilt. It's reasonable to want an attorney and not speak. But on the other hand, if this is a stepfather, you would kind of expect him to be helpful. and to want to help them. But if he thinks that they're focusing on him as a suspect, then it's understandable.
Yeah, well, and I would take the position that he gave his alibi. He took and passed a polygraph test. They should let him go.
Well, they did let him go. They didn't hold him, but...
Yeah, but they still considered him, maybe not the prime suspect, but a suspect.
Yes, he was the lead suspect to a couple of the police that were investigating at least.
Yeah.
So in early October, police released a sketch of a suspect or witness who'd reportedly been seen in a black Chevrolet Monte Carlo at the park on the night of the shootings. And they received over 100 phone calls on the day after the sketch was released to the public. Police addressed rumors that Ethan Dixon might have been involved in a confrontation with another teen just days before the shooting, so this discounted the rumor and blamed it on comments made by a police officer. So it wasn't really a thing. A police officer had just been throwing out ideas, it seems like.
Yeah.
Investigators also looked into a 1980 incident in Concordia, Kansas, where 2 young people were shot to death while they were sitting in a parked car. But in the end, Deputy Chief Campbell said that while the cases were similar, he didn't believe they were connected.
So Northside High School students returned to classes on the Monday after the murders, like just 2 days.
Well, yeah, school was scheduled.
Yeah.
They didn't cancel it.
Things were far from normal, though. 2 well-known students were gone, shot to death while sitting in their car at a local park. In a book written on these murders, The Westside Park Murders, Muncie's Most Notorious Cold Case, by Keith Royston and Douglas Walker, class treasurer Amy Leffingwell recalled the shock she felt about her friend Ethan's sudden death. His desk was empty, she's quoted saying in a 2019 interview. I had a lot of classes with Ethan. His desk was empty. Amy did not remember any large-scale meetings of students, faculty, and counselors. She says, I don't think they gathered us in a group. If you wanted to talk to somebody, you could, but mostly we talked among ourselves.
So I don't think that mental health and support were quite looked at the same in the 1980s, and it probably would be handled very differently today. But kids were kind of left on their own to deal with this, which is tough. That's a rude awakening for a young person to see the mortality of a schoolmate.
Particularly in that fashion.
Well, yes, very brutal.
Yeah.
So Kay Rankin, Kim's cheerleading sponsor, said in another 2019 interview, "It was probably the worst day of my teaching career, worse than the shuttle exploding and 9/11 and the Oklahoma City bombings, because this was home." Ethan's friend Julie Davey, who had invited Ethan to go away that weekend, was, on the Monday after the killings, working in the school office during her free period, and her job was to collect and record student attendance records. The secretary in the office asked if she could disenroll Kim and Ethan from school, because she just couldn't bring herself to do it. So Julie agreed, and she had to take their information and pull their paperwork. So Julie Davey and Amy Leffingwell both remembered that students gathered outside of school hours to talk about the loss of their friends. And they all shared memories of Kimberly and Ethan and repeatedly asked themselves why these murders happened. No one could think of a reason or who would do this. So there were fears that someone out there had killed them and might do it again, like a random serial killer. So everyone felt very vulnerable.
So the initial police investigation focused on the lives of Kimberly and Ethan. They reviewed the 2 teenagers' activities in the hours leading up to their murders, but nothing turned up to explain why they were targeted. So this led to fears that there was a random killer on the loose in Muncie, and nobody was safe.
So I think it's important that we remember this was a really different time. Now, if 2 teens were murdered, police would have multiple resources to help get a deeper look into their activities, relationships, and even their thoughts and feelings. And by this I mean cell phones and social media. You can really find out a lot about a person, especially a young person, using these venues.
You sure can.
But none of this existed in 1985. Captain Paul Cox was in charge of officer training at this time, but he was pulled away from those duties to help investigate the murders. He went through the case file and noticed that Deputy Chief Campbell was really focused on Kimberly's stepfather, Don Vogelgesang, but Cox saw many reasons why he was likely not guilty.
Yeah, we've talked about some of those. Then on Sunday, October 6th, the day after Kimberly Dowell's stepfather was supposed to talk to police investigators, but had not, on the advice of his attorney, the Muncie Star updated readers on the Westside Park investigation at the 1 week point. Muncie Police Lieutenant David Nicholson told the newspaper that investigators were working 14 to 16 hours a day and interviewing people all the time. But we have nothing new today, Nicholson said.
Yeah, about a dozen news sources had been interviewed. Nicholson was quoted saying, "We're picking up people, bringing them in, and interviewing them. After we've talked to them, they've been released." Nicholson said the case was hard to solve because there were so few clues. The newspaper article mentioned the knife that had been found on the dashboard of Ethan's Volkswagen and the gun holster that had been found under his body. Now, to me, that's one of the strangest things. If he was lying there and shot through the car window, how would the gun holster get under his body? They were pretty sure it wasn't Ethan's.
Yeah, well, somebody would have to put it there, right?
Yeah, I don't know. If they dropped it and Ethan fell back after, maybe? Something like that could have happened, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose you could have approached the car with the gun in the holster, and as you take the gun out of the holster, toss the holster into the car and it ends up on the driver's seat.
It could happen, I guess, if Ethan was sitting up at that time, which he might have been,
Yeah.
especially if Kimberly was shot first.
Now, the other question I would have, though, is what about the knife on the dashboard? What's that? What's going on with that? It wasn't used in the committing of the crime.
No, nobody was stabbed. There was no blood on it.
Do we know if that was Ethan's knife?
Yes, it was Ethan's knife.
Okay. Well, what's it sitting on the dash for?
Well, I don't know if he got it out to try and defend them or what. It's very strange. I don't know.
Or maybe they were going to be up there making out hot and heavy and they didn't want to be disturbed, so he had the knife out.
That seems unlikely.
I know. I was just wondering why the knife would be sitting on the dashboard.
Well, you're not the only one to wonder that, Dickie.
I'm sure.
It's a big mystery.
So the reward for information leading to an arrest grew to $10,000, $5,000 offered by the mayor, and another $5,000 offered by the American National Bank officials. The public was invited to contribute to the reward fund as well. 12 to 15 officers were working on the case at that time.
So 11 months after Ethan and Kimberly were shot, just weeks before the local newspapers published stories about how the crime was still unsolved after a year, a man named James Jimmy Swingley was pulled over by Muncie police. Swingley was stopped for driving through a stop sign. The 23-year-old Swingley gave police a false name at the time, Kevin L. Dixon, which really, seems strange because that was Ethan's last name. But the police officer that pulled him over at the time hadn't realized that. But also, Swingley had told people on the night of the murders that he had shot the two teens. And in a series of meetings on the night Ethan and Kimberly died, and in the days immediately afterwards, Swingley told several people that he had been in the park that night. And in one particular case, Swingley allegedly threatened an acquaintance, saying, "I've already killed 2 people tonight. I'll blow your brains out." Now, this could have just been the ravings of a jerk.
Could have been. Or it could be a killer.
Right, so he definitely had to be investigated.
Oh, yeah. Now, old Jimmy lived a life that was filled with crime and violent death. When he was young, the violence was done by others. On Friday, June 9th, 1972, Swingley's 8-year-old sister, Cindy Ann, ran out in front of their house and into oncoming traffic. She was hit by a car, suffering multiple serious injuries. A university student who saw the accident in his rearview mirror stopped and tried to give Cindy Ann CPR, but she died just after 4 p.m. that day at the hospital.
So Cindy Ann's surviving brothers were Jackie D. and Jimmy Swingley. Jimmy, born in 1962, was 9 years old when his sister was killed. Now, close to a decade later, on January 27, 1981, Jackie Swingley was arguing with his wife Becky in their home when she hit him in the head with a cigarette lighter. So I'm assuming this is one of those old-fashioned big cigarette lighters that would sit on tables or desks. You see them in the old movies.
I would think. Throwing my little Bic lighter at him isn't going to do anything.
So Jackie Swingley staggered and fell down and died.
Huh.
Yes. So Delaware County coroner at the time, Larry Cole, who was a physician, initially ruled his death a homicide. But investigators later decided that Jackie had died from a brain hemorrhage that was unrelated to the blow to his head. So what are we saying? It's just a coincidence?
So I guess they're saying that he had like an AV malformation or something that made his likelihood of bleeding a higher possibility.
But if it's not homicide, they have to be pretty sure that that would have killed him.
If they're trying to make it a homicide, they have to say that the blow to the head caused the bleed and killed him.
Yeah, I just don't understand how they came to the conclusion that it definitely didn't have anything to do with it.
All I got from this is that his hemorrhage was at the base of the skull, and he was struck on his forehead. So that's not the place where you'd expect to bleed.
Well, yeah, that's a good point.
So it looks to me like they're saying that he was going to have the bleed anyway.
Okay, well, that's a little strange to me, but I'll accept it.
It is strange.
Now, newspaper accounts noted that Jackie Swingley and his brother Jimmy had been drinking heavily all that day. Jackie Swingley was 20, and Jimmy Swingley was 18 years old at that time. The reason for the argument that day is known only to the two Swingley brothers and Jackie's wife Becky, but Jackie and Jimmy's mother later told a Muncie police officer that a little more than 9 months after Jackie died, his widow Becky gave birth to a baby that was fathered by Jimmy Swingley. So was this something between the brothers? Was he sleeping with Becky? You can take what you will from that story, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. So the fact that she gave birth to a baby fathered by Jimmy, but it was 9 months after.
Well, yeah, so I don't think she was pregnant when Jackie was killed or died. But there could have been an affair going on, because that's pretty quick. If you're widowed, and then she had to get pregnant within a month or so.
Right.
Within a few weeks of the murders of Ethan and Kimberly, Muncie police had another double homicide to investigate. This was on Thursday, December 5th, 1985. And two women, 37-year-old Carol Rivas and her 16-year-old daughter Wendy, were shot and killed in their home. Police quickly arrested their 20-year-old neighbor, James Randall Campbell, and he was charged with the murders. Wendy was identified as his sometime girlfriend. So he had threatened Wendy, and police said he kicked in the door of their home. He first shot the mother and then the daughter. So in May 1986, James Randall Campbell was convicted and sentenced to 120 years in prison. It was a real relief to the people in Muncie to see the quick resolution of this crime, but it also put more pressure on investigators to solve the Westside Park Murders. So on Monday, October 7th, 1985, Deputy Police Chief Campbell released a composite sketch of a man who was wanted for questioning in connection with the shooting. The drawing was of a man with glasses with his hair parted down the middle. In the Muncie Evening Press, he was described as a white male, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing 150 to 160 pounds, about 24 years old, with a slender build and a thin face with acne scars. In a 2019 interview, Campbell said the sketch was later determined by police to be of Jimmy Swingley, and the newspaper reported that the man may either be a witness to or a suspect in the double killing. Campbell also said that police had confirmed that Ethan and Kimberly were invited to a Ball State University fraternity party that Saturday night, but they didn't attend.
The following day, October 8th, the Muncie Evening Press published a drawing which laid out the location of Ethan's Volkswagen hatchback in the park. Police said the sketch of the suspect had set off 100 phone calls and tips from the public. Police said they had interviewed most of the people they wanted to speak to, and that they had removed them from their lists of potential suspects.
And now a word from True Crime Brewery, After Dark. It was just an ordinary night. The dogs had been fed and walked. We ordered Thai food for dinner. Afterward, I changed into my PJs, while Dick went and poured us each a beer. Then suddenly, I vanished. But Dick wasn't worried. He didn't call 911 or canvass the neighborhood looking for me. He actually found me on the back patio, on my lounge chair, scoring some quality time with Best Fiends. Now, I'd done this before, and I knew I would do it again and again.
Yes, others may have been concerned about your mysterious disappearing act, but I know you all too well. Jill was just having as much fun with Best Fiends as I do, so it's no mystery to me when she sneaks off to play. Best Fiends is a free-to-download mobile puzzle game with thousands of exciting levels for new adventures and challenges every time you play. Whether you have minutes or hours, it's always right there on your phone or tablet.
I do play often, and I'll admit that I do lose track of time once I'm in the Best Fiends playing zone. Best Fiends has new content and characters added constantly, so you'll never get bored. I've just reached level 962, and with literally thousands of levels, I never have to worry about running out of gameplay, because the more you win, the more challenges you face. It's really fun to strategize and figure out which matches to make to cause explosions and take down those dreaded slugs. And with offline play, you can have fun even if you're somewhere without a Wi-Fi connection.
Download your new favorite getaway, Best Fiends, for free today on the App Store or Google Play. You'll even get $5 worth of in-game rewards when you reach level 5. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends.
And just a quick reminder about True Crime Brewery Premium. If you'd like to support our show and get episodes ad-free, subscribing to TCB for ad-free and premium episodes might be just the thing for you. Once you subscribe, you'll get our regular episodes ad-free, plus a special members-only episode each month, and a gift that you can choose. You can choose coasters, a bottle opener, or the classic TCB snifter. Just go to tiegrabber.com and you can see our subscribing options. There are now over 150 shows in our members-only TCB Premium show that you can listen to or even binge. And you also have the option of subscribing through Patreon by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber for the same benefits. Now, one more thing, if you have comments, a case suggestion, or a beer recommendation to share with us, please send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or you can leave us a voicemail. There's a direct link in our show notes, and there's a widget on our website where you can click and record right from your own device. Either way, we love to hear from our listeners.
So a lab test would show that gunshot residue was on both Ethan and Kimberly, which led investigators to believe that their killer had been standing very close to the teens when he shot them, or that he had held the gun inside the car when he shot the kids.
Well, and that might explain how that holster ended up underneath Ethan.
It could.
But for weeks after their deaths, rumors and fear really overtook their peers.
Now, just weeks after the Westside Park murders, Jimmy Swingley left his friends and family in Muncie and moved to Florida.
And that's always suspicious if you move away after a murder.
Suddenly, right?
Right.
So Swingley told a police informant that he had been with two men on September 28, 1985, and that they had killed Jennifer and Ethan in Westside Park. Swingley also told the informant that he was leaving Muncie for Florida. While he was in Florida, Swingley mostly lived under a highway overpass. He didn't know anyone in the state who he could have been visiting, but that didn't prevent him from getting into trouble. Like he always did, huh?
Yeah.
He was arrested in Florida on December 5th, 1985, after he held a knife to the throat of a man. The man had taunted Swingley after Swingley bragged that he was moving to Australia, saying that he would never follow through with the move, and Swingley didn't like that.
No, so this was a guy who was definitely prone to violence. Kimberly's mom, Nancy, received an anonymous call after Kimberly's murder, and she would describe this as one of the cruelest telephone calls imaginable. So what sounded like a young man or a teen on the phone told Nancy that Kimberly had been an innocent bystander and that Ethan had been the intended victim. It was one of many disturbing calls, likely made just to hurt Nancy and not to comfort her. Now, not only had her daughter been killed, but her husband Don, Kim's stepfather, was the target of the police investigation. or at least one of the targets, because Campbell, the deputy police chief, had focused on Vogelgesang early in the investigation and spoke publicly about a person close to the victims in his interviews with reporters.
Yeah, but Nancy Vogelgesang consistently defended her husband. She said that he had arrived home from a football game before the shootings occurred, and he didn't go out again that night until about 12:30 a.m., after Nancy asked him to go look for Kimberly, who had missed her 11 p.m. curfew. Years later, in interviews with Don Vogelgesang through his attorney, Vogelgesang maintained that he was innocent. He also complained that investigators' focus on him interfered with finding the real killer. He said if they had properly conducted a vigorous investigation of the facts that they had, and had listened to what Nancy and I had to say, I am convinced the killer or killers would now be in jail. And he said this in a 1997 interview. It was easier to follow one man's preconceived notion that it had to be the stepfather, rather than get down to the hard work of solving a horrible crime.
Now, Nancy also gave a statement to her husband's attorney. She said, "To me, this is a nightmare that not in one's wildest dreams could be made up. I want to know what happened that night, and I would not protect anybody to solve this murder." And Nancy was very believable as a grieving mom.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Kay Rankin, one of Kimberly's teachers and her cheerleading sponsor, said she didn't believe the rumors about Kimberly's stepfather. She said it's a parent's worst nightmare. Kimberly's mom, Nancy, died in 1987, a little more than 2 years after Kimberly was killed in Westside Park. She had been attending candlelight services at High Street United Methodist Church when she had a fatal heart attack. Her funeral service was held at the same church where Kimberly's funeral had been held just 2 years earlier. So incredibly sad.
Well, I guess. Now, Jimmy Swingley had gone to Florida after the Westside Park murders, and some people even told investigators that he had left town the very next day after the murders. By August of 1986, he had returned to Muncie, and that's when Swingley had another run-in with the police.
Yeah, it was August 17th, 1986, when police pulled him over, and he'd given that false name of Kevin Dixon and told the officer that he lived in Lakeland, Florida. He was charged with driving without a license on him and running a stop sign. Court records from 1991 confirm that Swingley failed to appear for his court hearing, and he didn't pay any judgment or court costs. From the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, Swingley had several more run-ins with the law. Court records show that he was charged with check deception, drunk driving, theft, burglary, intimidation, disorderly conduct, and public intoxication. So he's just an all-around fun guy, I guess.
Sounds like.
He was given 1 year of probation and was ordered to stay away from his victim, Roscoe Essex, who later played a role in Swingley's prosecution and conviction on a murder charge. So until that murder case, Swingley's biggest offense was for several burglaries. In 1985, Swingley, who was then 22 years old, was one of a dozen men charged with racketeering in connection with a series of business burglaries. These burglaries happened between February and May 1984 at 3 farm supply businesses, 2 drugstores, and an electronics store. Swingley and his co-conspirators were indicted, but Swingley's attorney argued that he was not guilty and that the prosecutor's office had failed to provide evidence that he was involved in these crimes at all. So Swingley's charges were dismissed on September 9th of 1985, 19 days before Kimberly and Ethan were shot to death. The Westside Park killings were often referred to as a Lover's Lane crime in the supermarket tabloid, the Weekly World News, which more often reported on news like aliens and reincarnations of Elvis, stuff like that. The Muncie Evening Press reported that the killings were featured in the November 12, 1985 edition of the tabloid under the headline, Lover's Lane Murders. Now, the most notorious Lover's Lane killer that I could think of is probably David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. And he was arrested in 1977, charged with committing 8 shootings in New York City. Also famous but still unsolved are the Zodiac killings in the late 1960s and 70s, and those happened in San Francisco. So people had their thoughts on killings like that when they heard this.
Yeah.
It would make their mind go to a serial killer.
Right. Amy Leffingwell, the class treasurer who was friends with Ethan, would recall that right after the murders of Kimberly and Ethan, one of their mutual acquaintances responded strangely. Joseph, which is not his real name, seemed more unsettled by the killings of their classmates than anyone else. He seemed emotionally disturbed and obsessed with the killings. Amy described how Joseph came to her house one night and tapped on her window, asking to come inside. She remembered that he had even told some friends that he had a knife, and he could kill them all, and no one would stop him.
Yeah, Joseph went into the military after graduating from Northside High School, and years later he was living in a Muncie housing project. So Amy wondered for years after if Joseph had committed the murders of Ethan and Kimberly, or if the murders had just pushed him over the edge. Joseph was not the first person who seemed threatening after the killings, and stories about suspicious activity continued over decades, and it was shared with the investigators. But most were just vague suspicions, and it really led to nothing.
In 2012, Muncie police talked to a man who claimed to have heard some relatives talk about helping a man after the murders. There's like 3 degrees of separation or something.
There's so much, yeah.
In 2013, a retired Delaware County police officer told the Muncie police that he had been told that the son of a prominent local person was involved in the murders. In September 2014, the authors of the book The Westside Park Murders published a story in the Star Press newspaper about the case. After the article's publication, many people came forward with more theories and suspects. A county police officer contacted the Muncie police and expressed his suspicions of a police officer who had been in Westside Park the night of the murders. But it would turn out that this was just another suggestion which had no proof behind it.
Yeah, other tips came in, and they included a man who told police that the composite drawing of a suspect that had been released back in 1985 and reprinted in 2014 looked like a man he knew, although then he had no information that connected the man to the crime, so that's the kind of thing you really don't call in if someone looks a little bit like a sketch.
Right.
There has to be more to it. Now, a woman called to say that on the night of the murders, a friend of the son of her boyfriend came running into their house and said he had done a bad thing. And she said that neither she nor the boyfriend knew the name of this friend. Another man recalled that on the night of the killings, a guest had left a party, but then returned dressed like Rambo with a really wild look in his eyes. But he didn't have any evidence to connect him to the murders either. Another man came forward to accuse a woman of the killings, saying he believed that the woman had mistakenly killed Ethan and Kimberly when she thought she had caught her boyfriend in a parked car with another woman.
Wow.
So no shortage of tips or leads, although the quality of them is questionable.
Yeah, and they all led to nothing.
Yes.
So there were a lot of rumors, but no real information that could lead to finding the killer. When Muncie Police Patrolman Terry Winters found the bodies in Ethan's car in Westside Park, it impacted the rest of his life, and it also made him a suspect in the minds of some people. In a September 2014 interview with the Star Press, Winters recalled how shocked he was when he heard that some people believed he was the killer. He blamed the rumor on erroneous reports that said he was off duty and just happened to be walking his dog in the park. And that's when he found the murdered couple. Winters was walking his canine partner, but he was also telling people to leave the park after it closed at 11 p.m., part of his job. In 2014, calls to the mayor pressed the Muncie Police Department to order him to surrender his guns for testing to see if they were used in the crime. Testing showed that Winters' weapons had not been used in the killings, but the rumors never went away.
Yeah, so that really, I wouldn't say it ruined his life, but it followed him through his whole life.
Yeah.
In 1986, both the chief and deputy chief at the Muncie PD said that they believed the killings of Kimberly and Ethan were not random. Campbell said he still had the same suspect in his mind a year earlier. Kimberly's stepfather, Donald Vogelgesang. Campbell said that the suspect was still under consideration because after inconclusive results of a lie detector test, the person had refused to further cooperate with the department's investigation. But remember, Vogelgesang claimed that he had passed the polygraph. Still, Campbell said he was confident that this crime would be solved.
On the 10th anniversary of the murders, a police stakeout was done in Westside Park. Former Muncie Deputy Police Chief Robert Weller said that he had sent officers to the park just before midnight on September 28, 1995. I guess just on the off chance that the perpetrator would show up on the 10th anniversary.
Right.
Nothing came of this. Then in 2010, in a newspaper article written by the authors of the Westside Park Murders, Keith Royston and Douglas Walker, on the 25th anniversary of the murders, led one investigator to focus on a man who had often been mentioned in connection with the murders. And you'll recognize this name, Jimmy Swingley.
Yes. Within a few days of the murders, people had begun telling police that they believed Jimmy Swingley was involved. On October 5th of 1985, a man whose house was broken into just a few houses down the street from where Swingley lived said he believed Swingley had committed the burglary. The man told 2 police officers that he believed Swingley was involved in, or at least had some knowledge of, the Westside Park murders. In early December 1985, around the same time Swingley was arrested in Florida for holding a knife to a man's throat and threatening him, Muncie police officers began talking about Swingley as a possible suspect. Police interviewed Swingley's girlfriend, whom he later married, and on September 16, 1987, less than 2 years after the killings, Jimmy Swingley was given a psychological stress evaluator test by the Muncie police, and he failed 3 relevant questions, and all 3 were in reference to the 1985 murders in Westside Park.
In January 1986, 4 months after the murders, police talked to a man who said that Jimmy Swingley was afraid police would look for him in connection with the murders. A police investigator was told in February 1987 by a man close to Swingley that Swingley had come to his house the night of the homicides and said that he had been with 2 other people in Westside Park that night. A drug deal had gone bad, Swingley told the man, and teenagers in a parked car had been killed. Swingley told the man that one of the 3 men had pulled a gun and the holster had come out with it. So this lines up with the holster that was found in Ethan Dixon's car. But that information had been reported to local papers, so it could have been made up to fit the facts of the case.
True, but he seems like a good suspect to me.
Yeah, he does.
11 years after Kimberly and Ethan were killed in Westside Park, there was another murder that made headlines in Muncie. Brian Insko, who was 32 years old, was found nearly decapitated in his apartment on November 11, 1996. 19-year-old James Essex called 911 after he found his roommate dead. Insko was on his bed with a pillow over his face, and police found a knife nearby. Police came to believe that James Essex had beaten Insko with a shovel, and then Jimmy Swingley cut his throat. James Essex worked out a deal with prosecutors that he wouldn't be charged in connection with the murder in exchange for his testimony against Swingley. So the dispute that led to Insko's murder was over $47 that he owed for the rent on the apartment. But if he would do that, I could certainly see him shooting Ethan and Kimberly.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a big leap for me.
But didn't that James Essex get quite a deal?
I guess. So in 1997, a woman close to Swingley told police that he had dropped the knife he used to kill Insko down a storm drain. And another woman told police that Swingley said he cut Insko's throat to put him out of his misery. A pathologist who examined Insko said his head was mostly severed from his body. Insko died of exsanguination, or severe blood loss from cuts to his carotid artery and jugular vein. Now, on May 22, 1998, a Delaware County grand jury indicted the 35-year-old Swingley on a murder charge for Insko's death. The prosecutor in the case calls Insko's killing about as brutal a murder as you'll find in Delaware County, noting that Swingley had practically cut his head off. Swingley's defense attorney said that Insko's roommate, James Essex, and Essex's father, Rocky, had actually committed the crime. On February 18, 1999, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Swingley guilty. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison.
So in March of 2012, a person close to Swingley was interviewed by police and said a Swingley associate had owned a Monte Carlo. Remember, a Monte Carlo had been seen near Ethan's car. This man told police that in the morning after the murder, Swingley woke him up and said that a man who he had been with had shot 2 people in Westside Park after an argument. Swingley didn't specify that he was in the park, but this man believed that he was. The man also told police that the Monte Carlo had been taken to Arizona where it was destroyed. A woman interviewed by police at around this same time in 2012 confirmed that the Swingley associate had driven a Monte Carlo. In 2012, investigators reviewed a report from a law enforcement agency outside of the Muncie Police Department that had been told that the Westside Park killings had resulted from a dispute in the park. So the report said that Ethan Dixon had pulled a knife to defend himself and that he was shot by someone in a group that had included Swingley.
2 years later, another woman who had been close to Swingley told police that Swingley had driven a 78 or 79 Monte Carlo. Then in April 2012, 2 detectives went to the state prison in Michigan City, Indiana, to speak with Jimmy Swingley. But Swingley was hostile when he saw the investigators. "Fuck you," Swingley said. "I don't care what you want. Fuck off." So the detectives left without interviewing him.
Well, in some recent reviews of the case, investigators went over the physical evidence, trying to determine whether scientific advances that have happened since 1985 could help solve it. But these killings are really unlikely to be solved by any new methods because the killer hadn't left behind any DNA and the murder weapon had never been found. So they really don't have much to work with.
No, you got to get someone to confess.
Probably, yes. In a recent interview with Kimberly's father, Anthony Dowell, he recalled the last conversation that he had with his daughter. This was on the Saturday morning before she was killed. Remember, he was living in Indianapolis, so he was calling and checking in with her about her coming to spend that weekend with him. But according to Anthony Dowell, Kimberly said, "Dad, I can't. Something's come up." And Dowell believed that something was on his daughter's mind. He described Kimberly as a girl who never got into trouble, was very smart, and very well spoken. And while admitting that he had no idea who the killer was, Dowell did say he never thought that Don Vogelgesang was responsible. He said that Kimberly had always had a good relationship with her stepfather, so there didn't seem to be a motive there.
No, it sure doesn't. Now, in a letter to police thanking them for their renewed interest in his son's case, Ethan's father described Ethan as a sweet boy who was bright and affectionate. He added that Ethan and Kimberly would have been assets to society had they lived. In late 2018, a detective returned to the Wabash Valley Correctional Facility, where Swingley was serving time for killing Brian Insko. This time, he had a body warrant to get a sample of Swingley's DNA, and this could be compared to any DNA possibly collected from the leather gun holster found in Ethan's car. Now, the detective expected Swingley to do the same thing, tell him fuck off, as he had done in April 2012. But when the detective explained that he had a court-ordered warrant to collect some DNA, Swingley not only agreed to give the DNA sample, but he also sat down for a 40-minute interview, complete about-face. Swingley responded to questions about the murders by saying they had the wrong man. He said that not only had he not killed the teens, but it was his understanding that Kimberly's stepfather had committed the crime. So at least they did have, finally, Swingley's DNA.
Which again led nowhere.
Led nowhere.
Swingley's DNA didn't match what is likely the only piece of evidence belonging to the killer of Ethan and Kimberly, the gun holster that was found in Ethan's car. Potential DNA evidence on the holster had been damaged since 1985, but some detectives are still convinced, to this day, that Swingley killed Ethan and Kimberly. So who really killed these kids? Remember, when police were investigating the crime, their attention was drawn to a Monte Carlo that was seen in the park that night. After the murders, police worked on identifying several scenarios and suspects. When police began investigating the crime, their attention was drawn to a Monte Carlo seen in the park that night. Police focused on finding that vehicle and also a second car. They released a composite sketch of the car's driver based on descriptions from witnesses, but then police finally said they didn't think the man and his vehicle had anything to do with the killings. So there's one you can kind of scratch off the list.
And then police also looked into rumors that Ethan Dixon had recently had an argument or a fight with a Southside Muncie teenager, possibly at the scene of cruising by local teenagers. The idea that Dixon felt threatened after the incident gave an explanation for Ethan having a knife in his car, but police were unable to confirm that any altercation had ever happened.
Dead ends.
Don Vogelgesang, Kimberly Dowell's stepfather, was a focus of some police officers early on in the investigation. He was never charged by police, and he told the Star Press in 1997 that the rumors had nearly ruined his life.
Well, I can't imagine what it's like for people to think you killed someone and you live in this town and people are looking at you sideways.
Exactly.
Yeah, that would be really tough. One of the most frightening theories in the case was that the two victims were targets of a random killer who was just passing through the city. And a lot of people were afraid of that. Police looked at a similar incident in Kansas 5 years earlier, but these two cases weren't connected. So they really didn't have much to go on with that theory either.
No, every place they turn is a dead end.
Because Ethan and some of his friends were big fans of role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, rumors suggested that the murders had been a fantasy, acted out, which had gone wrong. But investigators found no legitimacy to these rumors. Doesn't make sense at all, really.
No. The Muncie Police Department holds to the fact that they have not forgotten about this murder, even though it's 37 years old. While the Muncie Police Department detectives who led the original Westside Park probe have retired a long time ago, many officers can recall participating in the investigative efforts over the years. One MPD Sergeant, Brent Brown, recalled during a 2015 interview that he and other officers were assigned to hide in the park on September 28, 1995, on the theory the killer might return on the 10th anniversary of the crime.
Well, that was a long shot at best. Brown said that he and other officers questioned about 6 people who showed up at the park that night, but none seemed or claimed to know anything about Ethan and Kimberly's murders. So he would estimate that there's been up to a dozen serious suspects over these years. Despite all the time that's passed, the Westside Park murders are still very familiar to many Muncie residents. Now, one problem in the investigation has always been identifying a motive. There was no evidence of drug use or any illegal behavior, and the teens were in a public park, which had been considered a very safe place prior to that.
Yeah, several investigators and Muncie residents have theorized that the teens were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Asked if he thought he knew who was responsible for the murders, one former detective said he did. Nathan Sloan, a Muncie police officer who conducted an extensive investigation, confirmed the man he believes to be responsible went to prison for another's murder. Sloan began his review of the Westside Park case in February 2012. During his review, Sloan met with Jimmy Swingley, and that is likely the person he considered the prime suspect.
Well, he seems like the closest thing to a suspect.
He certainly does.
But they don't have enough to indict on that.
No.
Now, Delaware County Prosecutor Jeffrey Arnold confirmed in an article in the Star Press that the suspect cited by Sloan is incarcerated for several years after being convicted in an unrelated case. The suspect is in prison, Arnold said. Hopefully that gives the community some kind of closure. But I don't think it does, because we don't know for sure it was him.
Yeah, I think until you have more definitive proof that he's the killer, yeah, it's just supposition.
Exactly.
We think this is the guy who did it.
Yep, so it's a cold case that endures to today. Police have asked anyone with information about the Westside Park murders to contact the Muncie Police Department's Investigation Division, and the number is 765-747-4867.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, so we have a little something different for feedback today.
Yes, we do. One of your favorite theories from years ago, early case we did. Very famous case. Famous right now, as a matter of fact. What could that be, you ask? Well, it's the owl theory. Anyone who's been following the Michael Peterson story, they're likely to be aware of the owl theory.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of become a topic of discussion again because of the HBO series, The Staircase.
Yes. And we have a listener who is very interested in it. We'll play her voicemail.
I also am going to play an explanation of the owl theory by the attorney Larry, who lived near the Petersons and came up with that theory. But first of all, we're going to play the voicemail from Karen.
I am watching The Staircase, the one with Colin Firth, and I just love it. I think it's so well done, and I truly, truly believe in the owl theory. I really do. And I'm going to send you a link, maybe you've read it already, but from David Rudolph, Mike Peterson's lawyer, his website about the owl. And if you scroll down in the comments on his section, he has fascinating information that contributors have put in. So anyhow, I really truly believe the owl theory.
Well, thanks, Karen. You got cut off there. I guess you ran out of time, but we really appreciate your voicemail. I really loved the Staircase HBO drama as well. And you know what's funny? When I watched the documentary, I really felt like he was innocent. But then the drama with Colin Firth kind of made me think, oh, he's just a narcissistic liar and he's guilty. But then the owl theory, I also think, sounds like it could be possible.
Yeah, I think it's possible. It's a tough one.
And the neighbor came up with the theory. So why don't we listen to the neighbor explain the owl theory, and then we'll talk about what Peterson's former attorney David Rudolph had to say about it as well.
Let's do it.
Why do I think the owl theory is credible? Mainly because it is supported by a great deal of people who are ornithologists, medical examiners, writers of books in regard to this particular case, who have examined my evidence and put it in a proper perspective and tried to show what did happen, because there's real specimens to look at. It's real evidence. Pictures of the actual photograph of the hair shaft with feathers wrapped around it, with blood holding the feathers onto her hair. And that's what I call a smoking feather. And that is, I believe, proof positive that this attack was done by a bird of prey. If it is a bird of prey that did the lacerations that allowed Mrs. Peterson to unfortunately bleed to death, acidulate, then Mr. Peterson is an innocent man, because that doesn't qualify as a homicide. It qualifies as an attack by a wild creature. As long as it's not a breaking of the law, then he's an innocent man. He should have his innocence restored immediately, or at least look at it in a court of law.
Okay, so I found that fascinating. We know.
Very.
Yeah. So the owl theory essentially says that a barred owl, B-A-R-R-E-D, attacked Kathleen, got tangled in her hair, and gave her some serious injuries on her scalp, actually removing part of her scalp. And then, it kind of seems like a far-fetched series of events after that, but it is possible that she went into the house, tried to go upstairs, and was bleeding really heavily and fell down the stairs. So, the recording by the Petersons' neighbor, Larry Pollard, who was also a friend of the Petersons, really took a fresh look at the evidence, and that came about around 2009. Her autopsy did reveal 7 lacerations, including some very deep ones, in the back of her scalp. Also, there were tiny pine needles stuck to one of her hands, which both held clumps of her own hair. Now, to me, that's pretty convincing. As Pollard discovered, the strands in her left hand contained 3 small feathers. Also, as Pollard and several ornithological experts noted, the pattern and shape of the cuts on Kathleen's head suggested a weapon, not at all like that blowpoke fireplace tool. So, essentially, Pollard said that if the culprit was an intruder, it was a barred owl. And it is a common species around Durham where they lived. Now, one of the most convincing things was that there were 2 drops of blood out front of the house and a smear of blood on the doorway, which could have come from Kathleen stumbling into the house. In the Staircase HBO drama, which showed a scenario for each possible way Kathleen died, murder, the owl, or just falling down the stairs, in the show, she's taking out her decorative Christmas reindeer to the front lawn when an owl attacks. And you know what I really love in the show is whenever they're outside, well, maybe not whenever, but many times when they're outside, you hear an owl.
Right.
Yeah. So if she goes inside, tries to go up the stairs for towels, and her scalp is bleeding profusely, then she could have slipped and fallen down the stairs. Except why go upstairs for towels? Were there none in the downstairs in the kitchen or anything? So that's one question I had about that.
Kathleen also had a thyroid cartilage injury that could have suggested strangulation, but that was not part of the prosecution's story of how Kathleen died. What's more, while the injury to that cartilage was consistent with strangulation, her body showed no other signs of being strangled, and investigators at the time agreed that the strangulation was not the most likely cause of the injury. So her hyoid bone was intact, and that's almost always going to be broken when there's manual strangulation.
Exactly, yeah. Now, the HBO Max version of The Staircase makes it pretty clear that Kathleen wore a neck brace for some time in the months leading up to her death. And there was even some speculation that the neck brace was worn as a result of some kind of altercation with her husband. But the real cause of Kathleen's neck injury was a fall into the family pool, which happened about 90 days before her death. And also, her neck injury was never considered to be her cause of death. She had no neck bruising, and like you said, the hyoid bone was intact.
Yeah, the drama also made a big point of showing us that the Peterson house had bats in the attic.
Right, yeah.
And owls do eat bats.
And I found that interesting because they didn't mention that in the documentary at all.
I guess you're supposed to pick that up yourself.
I guess so. So what Karen was referencing was David Rudolph's online discussion of the owl theory. And he listed circumstantial evidence for the theory in his discussion and online. So, want to go over some of that evidence?
Yeah, he listed several things. Barred owls were living in the woods by the Peterson house. They can be aggressive and dangerous. They have been known to attack people.
Yeah, many times.
There are drops of blood on the outside walkway leading to the front door of the house. This is seen in police photos. There is a bigger smear of blood on the outside of the front door frame, also from police photos. And at least 2 of the wounds on Kathleen Peterson's scalp are in the shape of the talons of a barred owl. And you can see that in the autopsy photos. Then he goes on, the tiny wounds on Kathleen's face are consistent with the tip of an owl's beak. There was a feather found on her body. There was a twig found in dried blood on her body. There were numerous strands of her hair with the roots intact, so that means it had been pulled out and not cut out. And that was in the dried blood on her hands. Now, her head injuries were not consistent with a beating by a blunt object or on a stair, because she had no brain injury, no brain swelling. Didn't have any skull fracture, didn't have any type of bleeding on the brain. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, so I went online searching for owl attacks, and I was surprised by how much I found, actually. Now, I'll admit it's not a common thing, of course, but actually more common than you might think. In 2021, there was actually a rash of barred owls attacks in Atlanta, Georgia, and people gave accounts of big owls aggressively chasing after them and attacking them, mostly runners. A wildlife expert said that the owls can see people as competition for their food or during mating season and may attack. And at night, they're able to hunt silently and fly up right behind you. You don't know what's hit you. So victims described the attacks as feeling like you're being hit in the head forcefully, just out of nowhere. One of the runners thought he had an aneurysm that had burst in his brain, and a few of them started running with helmets. Another story I found was from Christmas Eve 2015. A police officer had an owl fly into his patrol car window and attack him. And he drove into a ditch, and the owl finally threw away, but not until it was in his car for 45 minutes. It showed no fear of the officer. So, I think it's a possibility. Now, another thing I found was a YouTube video by Todd Peterson. This is from December 2021, and this is Michael Peterson's son, one of his sons. And this was quite shocking to me. If you listened way back when we did our staircase episodes, back when we started, and they're probably pretty much a mess, they're from 2016, but I was really impressed with the Peterson family. But according to Todd Peterson, the family was actually very dysfunctional, a lot of alcoholism. And in this video, he calls his father a serial killer, saying he killed Elizabeth Ratliff, the woman in Germany, his wife Kathleen Peterson, and he also blames him for the death of his mother Patty, who died of a heart attack while she was with Michael Peterson. So that was kind of mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, because he's been, or had been, one of his father's staunchest defenders.
Yes, bringing him money to prison and everything.
Yeah.
But really sad, he told about a history of alcoholism and how his father wasn't supportive and didn't really have nice things to say about Michael Peterson.
No, that's an understatement.
Yes, but definitely in the drama, I think Colin Firth portrays him as not a very nice guy, very manipulative guy. And maybe some of us were manipulated when we watched the documentary, because Peterson actually does give credit to that documentary for getting him out of prison.
Yes, he did.
Yep. So the mystery persists, and some people might be getting sick of this topic, but I never get tired of it. It's fascinating to me.
Well, it is a really interesting theory.
Yes. It's one of the more fascinating cases we've ever covered.
And I can see where you could draw the conclusions that people have from it, but boy, it's unlikely.
The owl theory?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I really don't believe that Kathleen knew about the bisexuality. So that could have been a motive right there. But it's still pretty much a mystery. I don't think anyone can really say what happened, unless Michael Peterson was to give a confession. But he's still very adamant in the latest things I could find that he's not guilty of this.
He didn't do it.
No. And he can be pretty convincing. But, a lot of sociopaths can be convincing.
They sure can.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Karen, for calling in with that. And we devoted our whole feedback segment because there's a lot I wanted to say about it. And I also thought people might like to hear what Larry Pollard had to say.
Yeah, that was an interesting little quote you got from him.
Oh, yeah, he's very entertaining. An entertaining guy.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll have more voicemails and emails on our next episode. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all of your feedback. We really appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you at the quiet end.
At the quiet end. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.